Throughout the course, I was just almost like nodding all the time. I'm like, yes, this is a question that I've had, this whole time, and thank you so much for answering it. Okay, my name is Asmaa Hussein. I am an author and a mother of one. My educational background is a Master's of Social Work, but right now I'm focused on writing. I wrote a memoir called A Temporary Gift, and now I'm focused on writing a series of children's books. So far, I've published a total of 9 books, and I started Ruqayyah's Bookshelf, which is a small publishing company based in Toronto here. I think the main issues that I have with the fiqh of women is that there are so many different opinions, and everyone and their mom wants to tell you one thing or the other about how to practice the faith or how to conduct yourself as a woman or whatnot. And there's a lot of, cultural influences as well, depending on what part of the world you're from. The reason I found this course so beneficial is that it sort of brought everything together, and I was able to understand the difference between, for example, the cultural practices that I grew up with versus the actual practices that are rooted in our faith. So Shaykh Waleed is the right teacher for this course because he's engaging. He doesn't deliver the material in a really dry way, which unfortunately is the case for a lot of books, for example, that you read on the topic, or a lot of lectures that you might hear on the topic in your masjid. So he delivers the material in a really interesting and really relevant way to us right now in the West, which I think is really important because a lot of times we hear about women's fiqh issues, but we're missing the cultural context. So that's really important. And I know that he's been working with the community for decades, so he has a lot of knowledge about these issues, and women from the community turn to him looking for answers for their questions. So I think, like a lot of younger people, whenever I have an issue, I Google it, right? And I see if there's any reputable website that I can turn to that has the answer for it. And sometimes it's a struggle because there's just so much information out there, and you don't know what's accurate and what's not, what's from the faith and what's not, what's fabricated and what's authentic. And I mean, I've also tried to watch lectures or once in a while ask somebody that's close to me, but it's a little bit difficult to have access to someone with this kind of depth of knowledge, someone who's going to give you a holistic answer to your question, someone who's going to understand your cultural context. So one of my main misconceptions coming into the course was this idea that modesty is a very black and white issue, that women have to dress in a very, very specific way without reference to cultural context, and they have to interact with members of the opposite sex in a very rigid way. But what I found in the course that was really refreshing is actually going back to the sources. We find that it's actually a lot more holistic than that, right? There are so many allowances for the way that you're raised and the cultural context that you live in terms of the way that you dress, even just the colors, the style of the dress, right? Because a lot of times when we think of Muslim women, we think of sort of like a very literally dressed in black, right? And that's the epitome of modesty, but that couldn't be further from the truth. So yeah, that was a great thing that Shaykh Waleed talked about in the course. Greatest way that my perception of the fiqh of women has changed after taking this course was that I started to look at things with a much, much wider lens. Like I think like a lot of Muslims raised in the West, we're taught that there's no gray area, right? There's no discussion around women's issues, right? There's either right or wrong, and if you do a certain thing, you're wrong. If you do a certain thing, you're right. Whereas the reality is that there's so much freedom, and there's so much allowances for our personalities to come through in our lives, for us to thrive in the different fields that we choose, for us to dress in such a variety of ways that it's really beautiful. And I think that it gave me a greater appreciation of my faith. So from one of the things I enjoyed the most about Complicated is that it's set up in a way that specifically addresses your questions from the start, right? So Even the course binder, it's all sort of FAQs, the frequently asked questions. And for me, whenever I have a question, I Google it, and that's not necessarily right. But so this was a great way to learn really based on the issues that you care about as a woman. And as far as I know, Shaykh Waleed actually interviewed hundreds of women to figure out what their main questions were, right? So throughout the course, I was just almost like nodding all the time. I'm like, yes, this is a question that I've had, this whole time, and thank you so much for answering it. So by the time I left the course, so many of my questions were answered, and I felt really at ease and at peace with the answers that were given. So one of the main things that I took from the course and that was a real life changer for me was the topic around raising daughters, because that's the most relevant to me. I have a daughter, she's only 5. But just all the issues around it in terms of when to start talking to her about modesty, when to start asking her to pray, how to broach the topic of modesty and when she's going to need privacy. So those were issues that I hadn't even thought about because she's still so young. But leaving the course, I feel like I was a lot more prepared for the years to come. So the course was really in depth, which I enjoyed. Literally A to Z, from the time a female's born until throughout her whole life, her different stages in her life, until death. And then the course was also really enlightening. I learned a lot of things that I didn't know before, and I was actually shocked how much I didn't know, right? Which was really cool. And it was interesting, sometimes you think of Islamic courses and you're like, it's going to be boring, but I'll take it just because I have to. But it was actually really interesting. And I think that's because it was based on the questions that women actually ask. If my best friend was considering taking this course, I think I would definitely recommend it to her. It was honestly a life-changing experience. It opened my eyes to so many different issues that some that I was struggling with and some that I hadn't even considered. And I think that for me personally, because I have a daughter, it's so incredibly important that I teach her and to all the parents out there, that they teach their children the correct and the authentic fiqh around women's issues, because there's so many misconceptions right now about what women are allowed to wear and do and what they aren't allowed to, and what roles they're supposed to take in their families. And I think that it can be really damaging. So knowing the authentic truth and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taught us, and through the Prophet, peace be upon him, is incredibly important as a woman and as a man too. So for me, I think Shaykh Waleed was the best teacher for this course. He's incredibly dynamic, he's incredibly understanding, incredibly compassionate, and I think that's really important for this topic.
Every question ever asked about women's fiqh is answered in this online course. But if you want to challenge that, you have live Q&A sessions to ask what hasn't already been asked. There's an open and close to registration. Click on the button and get access to your student portal before that window closes.